Peter Reynolds had never been afraid of a piece of paper in his life. He'd signed death warrants on marble desks. He'd shredded federal indictments without reading them. He'd held court in this exact hallway. 2,000 square feet of cold Italian stone and floor-to-ceiling glass, while men twice his size stood trembling at the far end of it. But tonight, the paper in his hand was an 8x11 lab report stamped in red ink, and his hand would not stop shaking. On the floor in front of him, 3 toddlers played in a loose, unconscious circle around a pink toy Porsche, the kind of car most adults couldn't afford in real life. They were dressed in matching red wool coats, buttons done up wrong on 2 of them, one missing a shoe entirely. They were laughing. They had no idea what was happening above their heads, but they had no idea they were the reason it was happening at all. Peter had seen his own face in a mirror for 42 years. He knew the jaw. He knew the dark curl of hair at the temple, the heaviness behind the eyes that his own mother had called the Reynolds burden. He knew it the way you know your own handwriting, not because you studied it, but because it lived inside you. He was looking at it now. 3 times. Sitting on his floor in red coats, 14 months old. Samantha was already on her knees, not because he had put her there, but because her legs had simply stopped working the moment he walked in, holding that report. She had been his housekeeper for 16 years. She had cleaned the room where his father died. She had ironed the suit he wore to bury his wife. She had never once asked him for a single thing beyond her salary, which he had never thought to raise, because men like Peter Reynolds don't think about what things cost the people who serve them. She was 34 years old. She was a widow. Her husband had died in a car accident 3 years ago, the same year Dominic had told her that Peter wanted to give her something. A gift, Dominic had said. A silent act of protection for a grieving woman who had given the Reynolds family everything and asked for nothing. Peter doesn't like to be thanked for it, Dominic had said. That's the kind of man he is. She had believed it, because she had spent 16 years learning exactly what kind of man Peter Reynolds was, and a man who left fresh flowers on her late husband's grave every month without a word. Yes, but that was the kind of man she believed him to be. Sir. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Her hand was pressed flat against her mouth. Sir, I swear to you, I was told you knew. I was told you. Who told you? It wasn't a question. In Peter Reynolds's world, nothing ever was. The 3 boys on the floor looked up at the sound of his voice. The one in the center, the one who smiled the way Peter's own son smiled, wide and slightly crooked, reached up and held out a small plastic wheel from the toy car, offering it to no one in particular, the way small children offer things to the air. Peter stared at that tiny hand, at that particular smile. The lab report said 99.9%. When your most loyal employee steals your name, your blood, and your legacy, and gives it to the one person in your house who never wanted anything from you. Who, what exactly, has been betrayed? Subscribe now if you haven't, and let's get this story underway. The gathering was small by Peter Reynolds's standards, which still meant 1,200 square feet of the estate's west terrace, dressed in white linen and pale gold lighting, a custom birthday cake flown in from a patisserie in Lyon, and a string quartet positioned near the fountain, playing pieces that none of the 6 children present were old enough to appreciate. Luca Reynolds was turning 4. He had his father's eyes and his late mother's laugh, and he spent the first 40 minutes of his own party dragging a remote-controlled Lamborghini across the herringbone stone while his guests watched with a reverence usually reserved for royalty. The Lamborghini was matte black. It had cost more than Samantha made in a year. She had not planned to bring the twins. But the regular sitter had cancelled that morning, and the boys had grown so fond of the estate, of its long corridors and cool floors and the particular echo their laughter made in the high-ceilinged kitchen, that bringing them along felt, as it always had, like the most natural thing in the world. She dressed them in matching navy linen shirts, smoothed down their dark curls, and told herself they would sit quietly in the garden while she managed the catering staff. They did not sit quietly. Felix had found Luca within minutes, drawn to the Lamborghini the way small children are drawn to anything that moves fast and makes noise. Remy had followed, as Remy always did, walking 2 steps behind his brother with that particular expression on his face. Brow slightly furrowed, the mouth pressed into a firm, unreadable line that Samantha had always attributed to his father's serious temperament. It was that expression that made Peter Reynolds stop walking. He had come through the terrace doors with a glass of Chateau Petrus in one hand and his phone in the other, mid-conversation with his estate manager about a security upgrade to the property's east perimeter. He stopped speaking mid-sentence. His estate manager continued talking for several seconds before realizing no one was listening. Remy was standing at the edge of the fountain, watching the older children with that furrowed, assessing look, and Peter knew that look the way he knew the weight of his own ring on his finger. He had seen it in photographs of his grandfather. He had seen it in the mirror every morning for 42 years. He had seen it, to most recently, in Luca, who was, at this precise moment, making the exact same expression at Felix from across the terrace. The 2 boys looked at each other. 2 different mothers. One face. Peter drank the rest of his wine without tasting it. He might have dismissed it. Bone structure was not evidence. Resemblance was not a confession. Had it not been for what happened 40 minutes later, when the kitchen staff brought out the small plates of strawberry tartlets that had been specially prepared for the children. They were made with a particular French cream, the same one the patisserie used in all their custom orders, the same one Luca's pediatrician had cleared after last year's reaction. Felix took 1 bite, then Remy. Within 4 minutes, both boys had the same raised flush across their cheekbones. Not severe, not dangerous, but identical and unmistakable. The same pattern that had sent Peter to 3 different specialists when Luca first presented it at 18 months. A rare sensitivity. Uncommon enough that 2 of the specialists had remarked on it as a genetic curiosity, something passed down through narrow bloodlines rather than acquired by chance. Samantha was already on her feet, already reaching for the antihistamine she kept in the inside pocket of her bag with the quiet preparedness of a woman who had long ago accepted that her sons were allergic to anything that came in a gold box. She did not look alarmed. She had seen this before. Peter watched her hands, steady, practiced, completely unaware of what she had just done to him. He looked at Luca, who was watching the twins with mild curiosity, for the Lamborghini forgotten at his feet. Then he looked at the twins. Then he looked at his son again. The string quartet shifted into something slower. A glass was refilled somewhere behind him. The evening continued as evenings do, indifferent to the quiet demolition happening inside one man's chest. He did not say anything. He refreshed the wine he had not finished, straightened his Brioni jacket, and smiled at the appropriate moments for the rest of the party. He kissed Luca good night at 8 o'clock, stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his study, watching the last of the guests' cars disappear down the private drive, and then sat down at his desk. He opened his laptop. He pulled up the contact details for the private medical laboratory he used for estate staff background clearances. He did not sleep that night. The medical suite on the lower level of the estate had been built 3 years after Peter's wife was diagnosed with the condition that would eventually take her. He had spent $4 million on it without blinking. Imported imaging equipment, a sterile processing room with climate controls precise to a single degree, a consultation area furnished in pale grey cashmere and brushed steel that looked more like a luxury hotel suite than a clinical space. He had told himself at the time that it was practical, that a man in his position needed medical infrastructure on site, that it had nothing to do with the fact that watching his wife make the 40-minute drive to the hospital had made him feel, for the first time in his adult life, completely powerless. The suite had saved her life twice before it couldn't anymore. After that, he had closed the doors and not returned. He opened them again at 6:15 on a Tuesday morning, while the estate was still quiet and the housekeeping staff had not yet begun their rounds. He carried two things: a sealed sample collection kit from the laboratory contact he had reached the night before, and a thermos of single-origin coffee from the Hacienda La Esmeralda estate in Panama, the kind that cost more per gram than most people spent on a full week of groceries. He drank it, standing in the doorway of the processing room, looking at the equipment that had been maintained in his absence by a technician who came monthly without ever being told why. He had collected what he needed quietly and without ceremony. Toluca's sample had been simple, a routine wellness record already on file with the estate's private physician, updated just 6 weeks prior. The twins had been more delicate. Samantha had brought them to the estate's kitchen that morning, as she always did on Tuesdays, settling them on the wide wool rug near the fireplace with a set of wooden building blocks, while she coordinated with the household chef. Peter had come through the kitchen once, briefly, with the practiced ease of a man who simply owned the room he was walking through. He had not stayed long. He had not needed to. By 7:30, the samples were logged. By 9, they were being processed through the suite's sequencing equipment, a model typically found in university research facilities and private biotech firms, not private residences. But Peter Reynolds had never seen the value in half measures. He did not watch the machine work. He went upstairs. He took a call from his legal team about a commercial property acquisition in Geneva. He reviewed the week's security rotation. He ate a breakfast he did not taste: soft eggs, shaved truffle, sourdough from the estate's own kitchen, at the long dining table, alone, with the morning light coming through the floor-to-ceiling glass and laying itself across the Calcutta marble in long white rectangles. He was a man who had built his life on the ability to remain composed while waiting for information he didn't want. The results were ready by early afternoon. The suite's system uploaded them to a secured private portal, encrypted, accessible only from his personal devices, now maintained by a cybersecurity firm that also handled the digital infrastructure of 2 sovereign wealth funds. Peter sat in the study, in the Hermes leather chair behind the desk that had belonged to his father, and opened the file. He had expected fraud. That had been the story he had been quietly constructing for the past 48 hours. Some form of elaborate manipulation, a paternity claim built on forged records, perhaps something Samantha had engineered with the help of someone who understood how DNA results could be presented deceptively to a man who trusted his own infrastructure. He had expected to find a discrepancy, a flag, some technical irregularity that his private physician could unpick. The report gave him nothing to unpick. Paternity probability, 99.97%. Confidence interval absolute. To cross-referenced across 14 chromosomal markers. Both subjects. Both boys. The machine had run the comparison twice, automatically, as it was calibrated to do when results exceeded the standard threshold, not because the system doubted itself, but because the probability was so statistically complete that the protocol required confirmation. Peter read the number 4 times. Then he set the tablet face down on the desk with the careful, deliberate movement of a man who doesn't throw things, because he had learned very early that men who throw things are men who have already lost control of the room. He stood. He walked to the window. Outside, the grounds rolled away in every direction. Manicured hedgerows, the long gravel drive, while the reflecting pool his wife had chosen because, she said, still water made a house feel like it was breathing. Beyond the stone perimeter wall, the rest of the world continued as though nothing had happened. He stood there for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and called Dominic. Dominic had not answered his phone. Not the first time, not the third. By the fourth call, Peter had stopped leaving messages and started making different ones, to the estate's head of security, to the man who managed the property's camera network, to the private physician who maintained the medical suite and who understood, without being told directly, that discretion was the primary condition of his retainer. By the time Samantha arrived for her afternoon shift, the estate had the particular quality of stillness that precedes something irreversible, the kind of quiet that had nothing to do with peace. She came through the staff entrance at 2 o'clock as she always did, her coat folded over one arm, her bag, a simple structured tote in cognac leather, a gift from the Reynolds household the previous Christmas that she used every day without knowing it had been selected by Peter's personal shopper at a cost she would never have permitted, hanging from her shoulder. She had left the twins with her neighbor. She had no reason to expect anything other than a Tuesday. Peter was waiting in the main hall. He was standing rather than sitting, which she noticed immediately. In 16 years, she had learned to read the architecture of his moods through small physical details, the set of his shoulders, the position of his hands, whether his jacket was buttoned. His jacket was buttoned. His hands were still. The DNA report was folded once and held at his side with the same controlled grip he used for documents he intended to act on. He said her name once. That was all it took. She stopped walking. Something in her chest recognized the weight in his voice before her mind had fully processed it, the way the body sometimes understands danger several seconds before the brain catches up. Her hand went to the strap of her bag. Her eyes went to the paper at his side. He unfolded it and held it out to her without a word. She did not need to read it. She could see the red stamp from where she stood. She had seen that same red ink in a different document 3 years ago. A medical consent form Dominic had passed across a clean white table in a private clinic on the north side of the city, at pointing to the signature line with a pen that caught the light in the way that expensive things do. Her legs folded beneath her before she made the conscious decision to kneel. The marble floor of the main hall, imported Emperador dark, cool even through the fabric of her uniform, met her knees with a coldness she barely felt. She told him everything. It came out in the uneven, halting rhythm of a confession that had been held in the body too long, not because she had been hiding it deliberately, but because she had never once believed it required confession. Dominic had approached her 4 months after her husband's funeral. She had still been wearing her grief like a second skin then, moving through the estate with the mechanical precision of someone who had decided that work was the only reliable thing left. While Dominic had been kind, he had been careful. He had sat across from her in the estate's staff sitting room, the one with the original Hockney print on the wall and the cashmere throw folded over the armrest. And he had told her that Peter had noticed her sorrow, that Peter, in his way, wanted to do something that words couldn't accomplish. He had used that phrase specifically, in his way. She had understood it to mean everything she already knew about Peter Reynolds. The flowers on her husband's grave, the Christmas envelope that was always twice what it should have been, the quiet accommodations he made without ever drawing attention to them. A man who gave without needing to be seen giving. Dominic had explained the arrangement in careful, measured language. A private clinic, a procedure. Children she could raise as her own, with the silent knowledge that they carried a bloodline worth protecting. He had told her Peter couldn't acknowledge it openly. Not yet. Not while certain alliances within the organization remained unstable. He had used the words mafia politics with the ease of a man who had long ago stopped finding them remarkable. He had told her that one day, when the time was right, Peter would find a way to make it formal. That she had his word on it. She had believed him because she had spent 16 years believing in the version of Peter Reynolds she had assembled through evidence, through small, unannounced acts of decency that a harder woman might have dismissed as coincidence. She had believed him because grief makes the mind reach for anything that feels like meaning. Peter had not moved while she spoke. He stood in the center of his own hall, on the floor his wife had chosen, in the house his father had built, and he listened to the story of how his name had been borrowed without his knowledge and given to a woman who had never asked for anything. When she finished, the silence was absolute. His voice, when it came, was very quiet. Who else knew? It was not a question about the past. It was the beginning of something else entirely. Peter did not sleep that night either. He sat in the study until the estate's automated lighting shifted from evening to night mode, a barely perceptible dimming of the recessed fixtures that his late wife had programmed to mimic the natural descent of dusk, because she had believed that a house should breathe with the day rather than resist it. He had never changed the setting. He had never been able to bring himself to. At some point, after midnight, he opened the lower drawer of the desk, the one with the Goyard document case his father had used before him, its chevron canvas worn soft at the corners, and removed a slim portfolio of records he kept separate from the estate's main filing system. Medical records? His own. The kind a man in his position maintained privately, rather than through any network that could be accessed, subpoenaed, or compromised. He had not opened this portfolio in over 2 years. He laid it flat on the desk beneath the pool of light from the Tiffany lamp, a piece his wife had found at auction, its bronze base green with age, its shade throwing warm, fractured color across the pale surface of the documents, and began from the beginning. The surgical record was dated 3 years and 4 months ago, a routine procedure, as these things went in the context of Peter Reynolds's life, an elective intervention at a private facility in the city, the kind of clinic that maintained no public profile and catered exclusively to clients for whom privacy was not a preference, but a structural necessity. He remembered the procedure clearly enough. 2 nights of recovery in the estate's medical suite, Dominic driving him there and back, the particular quality of Dominic's silence on both journeys, which Peter had read at the time as professional discretion and was now reading as something else entirely. He turned pages slowly, the way a man reads when he already suspects what he will find, but needs the document to confirm it before he can act. The consent forms were in order. The surgical notes were in order. The post-operative summary was in order. He turned past 3 pages of clinical data, blood panels, anesthetic records, a typed summary from the attending physician in the precise, uninflected language that private medical documentation favored. And then he reached the appendix section, the administrative paperwork that clinics attached as a matter of protocol and patients rarely examined. The 4th page of the appendix was a biological transport authorization form. It was a standard document, a single page on the clinic's watermarked letterhead, a form used to authorize the transfer of biological material between a clinical facility and an external storage provider. The Reynolds estate maintained a private biological storage account at a specialist facility across the city, again, the standard practice for a man of his means and his particular awareness of his own mortality. He had established the account years earlier, primarily as a provision for Luca's future medical needs. He had signed the original account documentation, himself, in this same study, with the same Mont Blanc pen that was sitting in its holder on the desk at this precise moment. He had not signed this form. He knew his own signature, the way he knew everything about himself that mattered, not through vanity, but through vigilance. The signature on the biological transport authorization form was close. It was genuinely close. Close enough that a junior administrator processing paperwork on a routine afternoon would have moved past it without hesitation. The loop of the capital P was slightly wider than his own. The terminal stroke of the final letter didn't carry the same downward pressure. Small things, the kinds of things that only mattered if you were looking. He was looking. He set the document flat on the desk and angled the lamp lower, the way a jeweler angles light over a stone he suspects has been treated. Then he opened the top drawer and removed a folder he had requested from his head of security that morning, a collection of administrative documents from the estate's internal files, all bearing Dominic's signature, driver's logs, equipment requisition forms, security rotation approvals from the 3-year period during which Dominic had held a counter-signatory role on estate operational matters. He placed one of Dominic's signatures beside the transport form, the wider loop of the capital, the abbreviated terminal stroke, for the particular way the ink distributed itself in the first downward press of the pen, a habit so ingrained it appeared in every sample, a physical signature within the signature, as identifying as a fingerprint. Peter sat back in his father's chair. 3 years ago, while he had been recovering from surgery in the medical suite 2 floors below, Dominic had driven across the city with a transport case and a forged authorization form, and a plan that must have been assembling itself in the man's mind for longer than Peter was yet able to calculate. He picked up the Mont Blanc. He wrote one name on the inside cover of the portfolio in his own unmistakable hand and underlined it once. Then he picked up his phone and called the head of his legal team. It was 2:47 in the morning. The call was answered on the second ring. The legal team's response arrived by 6 in the morning. A sealed document, brief, delivered by private courier to the estate's staff entrance, the kind of pre-dawn service that cost a significant premium and was worth every penny of it. Peter read it at the kitchen island over a coffee he didn't finish. The brief laid flat beside a bowl of fruit he didn't touch, the house still quiet around him, in the particular way that large, expensive spaces are quiet, not empty, but held. The brief confirmed what his instincts had already told him. The biological transport authorization form, when measured against the chain of custody documentation from the storage facility, created a gap, a clean, deliberate gap, the kind that didn't happen through administrative error, but through administrative intention. And someone had moved material, logged it under a forged signature, and then constructed enough surrounding paperwork to make the gap invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. It was careful work, patient work, the kind of work that required not only access, but time, and a detailed working knowledge of how the Reynolds estate's systems were structured. Peter closed the brief and began to look at Dominic differently, not as a man, but as a position, a set of access points, a key that had been cut over many years to fit more locks than it was ever supposed to open. He started with the security rotation files, which his head of security had sent overnight in a compressed, encrypted folder that Peter opened on the custom-built terminal in his study, a machine that existed on no external network, and maintained by the same cybersecurity firm that handled the estate's broader digital infrastructure. He went back 4 years and began reading forward. What he found was not dramatic. That was the first thing he understood, and it was the thing that disturbed him most. There were no large, obvious movements, no single moment of overreach that would have triggered a review. What there was, instead, was a slow and methodical expansion, so gradual that it had the appearance of natural professional growth rather than deliberate accumulation. In the first year of the period Peter reviewed, Dominic's access credentials covered the estate's vehicle management system, the staff scheduling platform, and the gatehouse security log, standard provisions for a senior driver with household coordination responsibilities. Unremarkable. And by the second year, those credentials had been quietly extended through a series of small administrative requests, each approved by a different member of the estate's operational staff, to include the external contractor management system, the medical suite's visitor log, and the secondary perimeter camera network covering the estate's north and east boundaries. By the third year, the year of the surgery, the year of the transport form, Dominic held counter-signatory authority on estate operational expenditure up to a ceiling that Peter, reviewing it now, recognized as having been set just below the threshold that would have required his personal approval. A ceiling that had been proposed, Peter now saw by Dominic himself, in a memo he had submitted to the estate manager with the language of modest administrative housekeeping. Peter leaned back in the Hermes chair and looked at the ceiling of his study for a long moment. He thought about the Bugatti Chiron that Dominic maintained as part of the estate's vehicle fleet, a car worth more than £2 million that Dominic serviced personally, claiming a specialist familiarity with its mechanics that Peter had never thought to question. He thought about the 12-camera security upgrade that Dominic had project managed 2 summers ago, recommending a particular installation firm overseeing the cabling work, signing off on the final placement of each unit. He thought about the fact that 3 of those cameras, the 3 covering the medical suite's external access points, had been repositioned during that upgrade to angles that, when Peter now reviewed the archived footage, created a narrow but consistent blind spot at the suite's staff entrance. Not a malfunction. A placement. He pulled the estate's communication logs next, internal messaging between senior staff, routed through the household management system. He was not looking for content. He was looking for pattern, volume, timing, duration. The way a cardiologist reads an ECG, not for individual beats, but for the rhythm beneath them. Dominic communicated with 3 members of the estate's operational staff at a frequency that had no reasonable professional justification. The estate manager, the overnight security supervisor, the administrator who processed routine medical and operational expenditure approvals. Each relationship, viewed in isolation, looked like collegial efficiency. Viewed together, across 4 years of time-stamped records, but they formed something else, a quiet infrastructure, a secondary nervous system running beneath the estate's official one, responsive to Dominic's needs rather than Peter's. He had not been driving cars. He had been positioning himself inside the machinery of the estate, the way a man positions himself inside an organization he intends, eventually, to control. Not by taking the top, but by making himself indispensable to every level beneath it. Peter picked up the Mont Blanc and opened a fresh page in the portfolio. He wrote the 3 names. He drew the lines between them. Then he sat very still in the morning light, in the house his father had built, and understood for the first time the full dimension of what had been growing inside it. The clinic occupied the upper 2 floors of a building in the city's financial district, the kind of address that announced its exclusivity through understatement rather than display. No signage beyond a brushed steel suite number beside a frosted glass door. No reception desk visible from the elevator lobby. A waiting area furnished in cream boucle and pale walnut, with a single oversized orchid in a matte ceramic vessel on the central table, and no magazines. Because the kind of clients this clinic served didn't wait long enough to need them. Peter had been here once before, 3 years ago, arriving in the back of the Bentley Mulsanne with Dominic at the wheel. He arrived this time in a car registered to a property management company that existed on paper and in a filing cabinet in his legal team's office. A slate grey Range Rover, unremarkable by the standards of this particular street, driven by a man from his security detail who understood that today he was not security. He was a driver. Nothing more. Peter wore a wool overcoat in a dark charcoal he didn't own under his own name, purchased the previous afternoon through an intermediary. No jewellery. No Patek Philippe. The deliberate absence of the watch felt strange on his wrist in the way that the removal of armour feels strange, noticeable precisely because of what was no longer there. He did not go through the front entrance. His legal team had spent 48 hours identifying the clinic's staffing structure through legitimate professional channels, employment records, industry registrations, the kind of paper trail that existed in regulated medical environments and could be read by the right people, like a map. The laboratory technician he was looking for was a man named Gerald Spores, 41 years old, certified in clinical genetics, employed by the clinic for 6 years. He had no disciplinary record. He drove a car that cost considerably more than his salary at this clinic could reasonably support. He had taken 4 overseas trips in the past 3 years. Business class, hotels that charged by the silence as much as the room, that did not align with any declared income beyond his employment. Peter had someone call ahead. Not to Gerald directly, but to a colleague, with a message carefully constructed to reach Gerald through the natural channels of workplace conversation, that a private client wished to discuss a historical procedure, that the conversation would be brief, financially considered, and entirely confidential, that there would be no record of the meeting. Gerald came to the side entrance at the agreed time, wearing his clinic lanyard tucked inside his lapel, a small, telling gesture, the instinct to conceal his professional identity, even while still inside his professional building. He was a slight man with careful eyes that moved quickly between Peter's face and the corridor behind him, before settling into the particular stillness of someone who had already decided that cooperation was the most survivable option. They stood in a service corridor that smelled of climate-controlled air and antiseptic, a place designed for the movement of equipment rather than conversation, its walls bare and its lighting the flat, even white of functional spaces. Peter did not extend his hand. He asked one question. He asked it quietly, in the same tone he used for all questions that had already been answered, not seeking information, but requiring confirmation. Gerald looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked up. He said that a man had contacted him through a private channel approximately 3 years ago, that the man had presented the arrangement as a private commission, a discreet procedure, fully authorized by the client, simply requiring a trusted technician who understood that certain matters were handled outside of official documentation. He said the payment had been in 3 installments, transferred to an account Gerald had opened specifically for the purpose and used for nothing else since. He said the man had been very specific about one thing. He had asked Gerald to remember, if he ever needed to remember anything, that what was being done was a kindness, an act of quiet generosity toward someone who had suffered a loss. He paused. Then he said it in the precise words, in the flat tone of a man reciting something he had told himself many times in the years since. The driver told me it was a gift for a grieving widow. The corridor was very quiet. Peter looked at Gerald for a long moment, not with anger, which would have been easier, but with the cold, appraising attention of a man cataloguing exactly what he was dealing with. Then he reached into the inside pocket of the charcoal overcoat and removed a single card. No name on it, just a number. He told Gerald to make himself available. He told him this would not be a request he could decline a second time. Then he walked back to the slate-grey Range Rover, and he did not look back. Dominic had always been good at reading weather. It was the skill that had kept him alive in rooms where other men had not survived, the ability to sense the shift in atmospheric pressure before the storm made itself visible, to read the small, ambient signals that preceded consequence. A change in a schedule? A door closed that was usually open. A phone call that lasted 30 seconds when it should have lasted 5 minutes. He had been reading the estate's weather for 11 days now, and what he felt in it was the particular stillness that precedes something irreversible. The first signal had been the security rotation review, a request that had passed through the estate's administrative system with no explanation attached, pulling 4 years of access logs and credential histories into a single compiled file. Dominic had a contact inside the operational staff who had mentioned it in passing over a brief exchange in the estate's garage, beside the Bugatti he no longer felt comfortable standing next to. The contact had not understood its significance. Dominic had understood it completely. The second signal had been the clinic. He had a peripheral connection there. Not Gerald directly, but someone adjacent to Gerald, or someone who moved in the same professional corridors and noticed when a man arrived through a side entrance in a coat that didn't belong to him and left Gerald Spires with the particular expression of a person who has just had their future rearranged. That signal had reached Dominic within 24 hours. He spent 2 days running calculations with the cold efficiency of a man who had always known, somewhere beneath the surface of his long game, that this day existed, that it had always been a matter of when, rather than whether. The plan he arrived at was not elegant. Elegance had been the first 3 years. What this required now was not elegance but leverage, the oldest and most reliable currency in his world. He contacted Samantha on a Thursday afternoon through the personal number he had maintained for her since the beginning, but not the estate's staff communication system, which he now assumed was being monitored, but the number she had given him years ago when they were simply colleagues in the same household, 2 people navigating the particular intimacy of service in a wealthy man's home. He had always been careful to maintain that connection, that warmth, that history of small kindnesses offered without apparent agenda. He told her he was worried about her. He told her that Peter had been making inquiries, that the DNA results had opened something in the man that Samantha did not fully understand, and that Dominic, from his vantage point, had seen in Peter before. He chose his words with surgical precision, constructing a portrait of danger that was vivid enough to frighten, but vague enough to resist examination. And he told her that the twins needed to be somewhere safe while things settled. He told her he had arranged a property, a quiet place, well-resourced, comfortable, where she and the boys could stay until the situation resolved itself. He described it in terms that would appeal to a woman who had spent 16 years in other people's luxury without ever inhabiting any of her own. A private residence, fully staffed, everything provided. He told her he would come himself, in the Bentley, at 7 the following morning. What Dominic had not accounted for was the change that 11 days of truth had made in Samantha. She sat with the phone in her hand after the call ended, in the small sitting room of her modest terraced house, its walls hung with photographs of her late husband, but its surfaces covered in the careful accumulation of a life lived on a housekeeper's salary. And she did not move for a long time. On the floor in front of her, Felix and Remy were building something with wooden blocks, their dark curls bent toward the same task, their small hands working with the focused, unhurried confidence of children who have never yet been given a reason to feel unsafe. She thought about the way Dominic had said the twins need to be somewhere safe, the particular placement of that phrase, the way it had framed her boys not as children to be protected, but as objects to be relocated, She thought about the clinic's waiting room and the table she had sat across from Dominic at 3 years ago, and how fluent he had been in the language of Peter's generosity for a man who, she now understood, had never once acted on Peter's behalf. She picked the phone back up. She did not call Dominic. She called the estate. She asked for Peter. She was put through in under a minute, faster than she had ever been put through in 16 years of service. And when his voice came on the line, steady and quiet, and carrying that particular quality of attention that she now recognized as the most dangerous thing about him, she told him everything Dominic had just said. There was a brief silence on the other end. Then Peter said, "Keep the call. Tell him yes." The morning arrived grey and still, the kind of February cold that settled into stone and glass and stayed there. By 6:15, the street outside Samantha's house held 3 vehicles that had not been there the night before, none of them conspicuous, none of them connected to each other in any way that a passing eye would register. A slate-grey Range Rover, a dark saloon parked at the far end of the terrace, a third vehicle, unmarked, positioned at the junction where the street met the main road. Peter was not in any of them. Peter was already inside the estate. He had chosen the room deliberately, not the study, which carried too much of his own authority and might, in a strange way, offer Dominic the psychological comfort of familiar territory. Not the main hall. Instead, he used a meeting room on the estate's ground floor that had originally been built for operational briefings, a spare, functional space that stood in pointed contrast to the rest of the property's carefully considered luxury. A long table in pale ash, 6 chairs, a wall-mounted screen, a recessed lighting set to its flattest, most neutral register. No artwork, no objects, nothing to look at except the person across the table. Dominic arrived at Samantha's door at 7 o'clock precisely. He found Samantha on the doorstep with the twins dressed and her bag over her shoulder, exactly as arranged. He found her composed in the way that people are composed when composure is the last task they have been asked to perform. He did not look closely enough to see the effort beneath it. He had always underestimated how much she had learned in 16 years of service about the discipline of keeping one's interior life invisible. He drove the Bentley Mulsanne, ivory over tan, to its cabin smelling of leather and the particular warm silence of a car that cost more than most people's houses, with the unhurried confidence of a man who believed he was controlling the morning. The twins sat in the back beside Samantha, Felix pressing his palm flat against the cold window glass, Remy leaning into his mother's side with the boneless ease of a child who trusts completely in the person holding him. They turned through the estate's main gate at 7:22. Dominic understood what had happened approximately 4 seconds after the gate closed behind them. In the moment he registered the configuration of vehicles in the courtyard, the positions of the men standing near them, and the particular quality of the silence that greeted the Bentley's arrival. Not the silence of an empty morning, or the silence of a room in which everyone is already in position. He was taken to the ground floor meeting room with the kind of firm, wordless efficiency that left no space for objection. Samantha and the boys were taken separately, guided by a woman from the household staff toward the East Wing's sitting room, where a breakfast had been laid on the low table and the underfloor heating had been turned up, and 2 sets of wooden toys had been placed on the rug in front of the fireplace. Peter was already seated when Dominic was shown in. He did not stand. He did not speak immediately. He allowed the room to do its work. The flat light, the bare walls, the table between them as clean and unadorned as a verdict. Then he reached forward and pressed a single key on the laptop open in front of him. The wall screen came to life. A clinic security footage, time-stamped 3 years and 4 months ago. A side corridor, a service entrance, a man in a dark coat carrying a temperature-controlled transport case of the kind used for biological material. The footage was crisp. The private security firm that had retrieved it had done so through channels that Peter had no interest in explaining to anyone in this room. The man in the footage was unmistakably Dominic. Peter let it run for 40 seconds. Then he closed the laptop. He spoke for less than 3 minutes. He described the forged transport authorization form. He described Gerald Spires and the 3 installments and the business class flights. He described the secondary infrastructure Dominic had built inside the estate's operational systems over 4 years. The access credentials, the camera placements, or the counter-signatory authority accumulated one small administrative request at a time. Then he mentioned the accounts. He named 3 of them, jurisdictions in 2 different territories, account numbers his financial team had identified through a process Dominic had apparently believed was untraceable. He stated, in the same level tone he had used for everything else, that all 3 had been frozen as of 6 o'clock that morning, pending a formal review that would be conducted by people who reported exclusively to Peter. The arrogance went out of Dominic's face, the way heat leaves a room when a window is opened. Not all at once, but completely, and with a finality that made the air feel different. His hands, which had been resting flat on the pale ash table, with the studied composure of a man who had rehearsed this moment, moved slightly, a small, involuntary withdrawal, the first honest thing his body had done in years. Peter watched it happen. He did not look satisfied. He looked like a man completing a task that had needed completing, precise and entirely without pleasure. He picked up the Mont Blanc from the table in front of him, clicked it once, and set it down again. "Now," he said quietly, "you're going to tell me who else knew." The paperwork arrived on a Friday morning, 3 weeks after Dominic had been taken from the ground floor meeting room by 2 men who did not work for any organization that filed public records. 3 weeks during which the estate had continued its routines with the quiet persistence of a well-run household. Meals prepared, rooms maintained, Luca driven to his nursery program and collected again, while beneath those routines, Peter's legal team worked with the focused efficiency of people billing at a rate that made urgency a professional obligation. Samantha had not returned to her duties as housekeeper. Peter had not asked her to. She had continued coming to the estate each day, not through the staff entrance, but through the main gate, a distinction that had required no announcement and no explanation. Simply a call to the gatehouse the morning after the Bentley had pulled into the courtyard, a change logged in the access system, a door that now opened differently for a woman who had always deserved a different door. The East Wing sitting room had become, without any formal declaration, the room where she spent her mornings. It had good light and underfloor heating, and a low bookshelf that Felix and Remy had colonized entirely, reorganizing its contents with the cheerful disregard for category that characterized everything they did. Someone had placed a cashmere blanket over the arm of the chair nearest the window, a gesture so quiet and so considered that Samantha had sat with it, folded in her lap for a long time, the first morning she found it there. Not quite able to speak. Peter came to her on the Friday morning, carrying a leather document folder, the Goyard case from his study, its worn corners softened by decades of use, and set it on the low table between them with the same deliberate care he applied to everything that mattered. He sat in the chair across from her. Outside, through the tall windows, of the estate's grounds held the last of the winter light, pale and even across the stone and the bare hedgerows and the still surface of the reflecting pool. He opened the folder and turned it toward her. The documents were formal and precise, the considered language of legal instruments designed to outlast the people who signed them. Adoption papers, A name change application. A letter of intent from his solicitor, drafted on paper so heavy it had a particular quality of permanence that ordinary documents lacked. Every page bore the Reynolds name, applied to Felix and Remy with the same clean legal authority that it had been given, years ago, to Luca. Samantha looked at the papers for a long time without speaking. The twins were on the rug behind her, Felix attempting to fit a wooden block into a space it was clearly not designed for. Remy watching him with the furrowed, patient expression that still, even now, rearranged something in Peter's chest when he looked at it, too directly. When she finally looked up, her eyes were steady in the way that eyes are steady when the person behind them has already done their crying, not in the presence of others, not as performance, but alone and honestly in the particular privacy of a small terraced house in the hours before the world required composure again. She told him that she needed him to understand something, that the miracle she had held on to for 3 years, the quiet, sustaining belief that she and her boys were quietly loved and quietly protected by a man too important and too complicated to say so plainly, had been a constructed thing, a story built for her out of her own grief and her own loyalty by a man who had understood exactly which materials to use. She needed him to know that she understood that now, that she was not asking him to repair something that had existed. She was asking him if he was willing to build something that hadn't. Peter was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that in another man might have felt like withholding, but in him had always been the sound of precision, of someone selecting the exact words rather than the approximate ones. He said that he had spent 3 years placing flowers on her husband's grave because he had believed, in the uncomplicated way that certain truths present themselves, that a woman who gave that quality of loyalty to a family deserved to know that her loss had not gone unnoticed. But he said that nothing Dominic had done altered the truth of what he now knew his sons to be. He said that the paperwork on the table was not a repair. It was a beginning. Then he picked up the Mont Blanc and signed his name on the first page. The same hand, the same pressure, the same unmistakable terminal stroke, and turned the folder back toward her. Samantha looked at the document for a moment longer. Then she reached forward and picked up the pen. Behind her, Felix finally forced the block into its space with a sound of profound personal satisfaction. Remy looked up from the rug, found his mother's face, and smiled the wide, slightly crooked smile that had started everything. Peter saw it. He looked away briefly, toward the reflecting pool and the pale winter light moving across its surface. Then he looked back.